Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohon, Jim Seibert, and Barry Harrison, and the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast is made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Driving the Line, the podcast that is always in the pursuit of safety. I am Jim Seibert. I'm thankful. As I was preparing for this podcast today, I was thinking how much I love the ag industry and how much I am thankful to get to work with some of the best people in the world that just continue to produce and handle commodities and things that feed us and drive some fuel and just kind of keep the wheels turning. We talk about truck drivers often, and we don't have to think too far or too hard to realize that if those 18-wheelers stopped driving all over the place, we would see prices skyrocket. And just the world as we know it, especially in the United States here, come to a screeching halt. And I was in my thoughts of thankfulness of who I get to work with and who I get to work for. The farmers really came to mind, that through their labor, we are feeding the world. And many of our listeners may not know this, but I came from some grain operations management, and I worked for a very, very large company. And what led me into that field was working on the farm and being a farmhand and driving grain carts, semis, and you name it, straight trucks. And it was kind of a badge of honor seeing how much you could haul to town. And if I'm driving off the farm, driving down a country road, I did not necessarily know what laws might pertain to me. And as I would stand on top of my grain elevator, about 140 feet up in the air, and I would watch the trucks go across my scale, all sorts of funny things I would catch. Guys that would pay attention to where the grain probes were, and they would hide bad grain in one corner of their hopper trucks, trying to get a little bit of money for that extra stuff out of the bottom of the bin. I've also seen guys augment their grain with a scoop of sand that's real tough to catch going across the grate. But as the grain buyer, we would certainly pay for that sand, and that's just a unique sidebar of guys trying to tip the scales, if you will, in their way. I have seen some crazy numbers of people hauling across our scales directly off the farm. And as I think back to those great times and lessons learned, now I have such a broad spectrum of ag customers that are hauling unique things. I've got milk, oil, propane, gasoline, diesel, guys hauling anhydrous tankers. I've got cattle haulers, big grain companies, guys hauling bales of hay and feed commodities all over the place. And there are an endless number of questions that all of these different items bring into my mind. I have customers in Texas, 60,000 acre customer with 120 employees that really, really want to still be a farm. And that's kind of a tough sell to me, that they're a farm and not a larger company. So today, in my confusion of some of these regulations and what pertains and what doesn't, I brought in the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Mike Bohon. And hopefully, the Missouri Monster, as we affectionately call him, hopefully today he can help clear my mind and some of our listeners that are either ag customers or just other people that are sharing the road with them have a better understanding of what applies to them and what doesn't. Mr. Mike, I'm so thankful you're on the call with me today because you've been down this road a time or two. I've never understood the saying that, hey, this ain't my first rodeo, as if people would think that by the second time you get on a bull, you've got it all figured out. But you've been down this road multiple times. And so covered farm vehicles versus ag exemptions. What is that?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm chuckling a little bit because you're talking about being your first rodeo, and I've seen hats before that say this is my second rodeo. So
Yeah.
a lot of times when we get into the regulations and we start talking about exemptions and what applies to us, what doesn't apply to us, sometimes it feels like, yeah, this may not be the first time I've dug into this, but there's still a lot of areas where we're unsure about. And I think a lot of your customers, a lot of our customers that are in the ag world feel that way because the challenges they come up with are one, they need to know the regulations if they're operating commercial motor vehicles that are regulated. And two, they need to understand what the exemptions and the exceptions are for those regulations. So, really, a lot of times people, when they think of the ag world or they start talking about farmers or people hauling ag products or ag commodities, they say, well, that nothing applies to them. They've got it easy. Well, the truth of the matter is, it makes it almost more difficult when there's exemptions and exceptions because they have to really understand that to know whether or not they're in compliance with the regulations. So the two items you just bring up there, the covered farm vehicle and the ag exemptions, one of the things that I think we need to do for our listeners is make a clear distinction between two specific areas of the regulations. So the first thing I'm going to cover came about in MAP 21, which was some changes in the regulations that came about, and it dealt a lot with the ag community and farmers, and it defined what a covered farm vehicle is. So there's some exemptions there. And I want to hit on this because there's a big difference between what a covered farm vehicle is and then what some of the other ag or farm exemptions were that were already in the regulations. So, covered farm vehicle. This could be a straight truck or articulated vehicle. You already talked about the truck coming into the scales or into the bins. You used to see a lot of straight trucks, but anymore everybody's got truck tractors and semi trailers or the hopper bottoms. So it can be a straight truck or articulated vehicle. It has to be operated by the owner or the operator of the farm or ranch, or somebody that's their family member, an employee of that owner operator. So it's got to be a farmer, whether they're own the land themselves or they're farming that land. It has to be operated by that owner or operator. They got to be transporting those agricultural commodities or livestock, machinery, supplies to or from that farm or ranch. So they're getting very specific on what a covered farm vehicle is. It's got to have a plate specified showing that vehicle is a covered farm vehicle. Here in Missouri, we call it the F tab or the farm tag. If we've got a vehicle rolling down the road and it's just a sticker on the license plate that's an F, we know that that's a farm plate. So it could qualify if it meets all the other criteria as a covered farm vehicle. Can't be used in a for hire capacity. So one of the things that I've seen in the past, especially back in my enforcement days, was we would have guys with a farm tag on their truck and want to get these type of exemptions as a covered farm vehicle, but they may take their grain to market, but then they may pick up a load of grain at the elevator and take it to another location in a for hire move. They lose all the exemptions at that point. So it's no longer a covered farm vehicle.
So somebody that's acting on behalf of the farmer, the producer in this specific incident, what if they're a big farm and they're hiring third party truck drivers? Do they then fall under that umbrella
If
of
they're an employee of the farmer, yeah, if they're contracting out their loads, then no. That's it.
okay,
We'll get into that. That's they may get some of those ag exemptions that we'll talk about in a little bit, but this is specifically for the farmer, their family, and their employees of the farm.
okay,
Okay.
all right, good, thanks.
The final thing on that covered farm vehicle is we're not hauling any placardable amounts of hazmat. That's a big thing. It's kind of a recurring theme in some of this. If it's especially with the trucks that we're typically going to see as farm trucks, it's got a GVWR or gross vehicle weight that's more than that 26,000 pounds. It's traveling within the state where it's registered or traveling out of the state within 150 air miles. It could lose those exemptions if it's a applicable amount of hazmat. So that's one of the things that I wanted to define up front. If you can meet all the criteria, and you can go in the regulations. If you're listening to me out there, if you're in the ag community and you're trying to wade through some of these regulations, that definition of covered farm vehicle is in Part 390 of the regulations, and it lays it out there exactly what it is. Everything I just read through, and even a little more detail, is going to be listed in that. So that's what a covered farm vehicle definition would be. And if you meet all that criteria, then we go over and we look at the exemption in 390.39, which lays out what they're exempt from. And to just kind of give you the high level overview of that, if they meet that criteria, the drug and alcohol testing, CDL requirements, hours of service, vehicle maintenance, and most of Part 391, which is the qualification of drivers, that's a big chunk of the regulations that apply to truck drivers. They would be exempt from those regulations as a covered farm vehicle. Okay. So I want to make that really clear. That is for farmers, their employees, and their family members that are basically working the farm. They're transporting ag commodities. They're not doing the applicable amounts of hazmat, that kind of stuff. They are exempt from a lot of the regulations that would apply to most of the trucking companies that would typically listen to our podcast, Jim. So when you're talking about your clients, the folks you go see, when we think of the co-ops, maybe some of the mills, some of the feedlots, things like that. Now we start looking, okay, well, maybe we don't meet the definition of a covered farm vehicle, but are there some ag exemptions out there that we might get? And yes, there are. And these two things, the covered farm vehicle exemptions and the rest of the exemptions in the regulations, they can overlap. And it can get very confusing. So what we're going to do now is set aside that covered farm vehicle and that exemption that the farmers typically get, and we're going to look at some of the other regulations that were in place before MAT 21 came out. So the first place we're going to start is Part 383. Okay, that's the CDL requirements for trucks that, and if you guys, obviously our listeners of our podcast, the folks that are in trucking, they know it's 26,001 pounds or applicable amounts of hazmat, that kind of stuff. We know the thresholds of a CDL, but states can provide a farm waiver for a CDL. So, and again, this is separate from the covered farm vehicle and the MAT 21 exemption, but the farm waiver sounds very similar to what that exemption is. And it's basically just if it's a farm vehicle, and it's operating within a state, it's controlled and operated by a farmer. And again, it's including that farmer's family, their employees, not used to transport anything other than the ag commodities, things like that. We're staying within 150 miles of the farm. If we meet those criteria, some states allow for a farm waiver. Missouri is one of those states. It's one of those things where if you're sitting in Oklahoma or you're sitting in Texas, any of these farm exemptions, especially when it deals with the CDL, it's good to go to the source. It's good to go to the state because they may be different. Most states are going to give that farm waiver exemption for the farmers out there. But that thing was in place before MAT 21, before the covered farm vehicle. But it sounds very similar, but it's an overlap. It's a separate exemption. Okay. The restricted CDL for certain farm-related services is something that, Jim, your clients that you deal with may or may not be able to obtain. So any state, whether it's Oklahoma, Missouri, Texas, and I mentioned those three states if you're listening to us. The reason why I mentioned those three states is because that's where I'm in Missouri, Jim's in Oklahoma, Kenny's down in Texas, Barry's in Oklahoma. So those are the states that I'm just mentioning. But check with your states. But a state can, at its discretion, waive certain parts of the testing requirements for certain CDLs for businesses like the ag chem businesses, custom harvesters, the retail farm outlets, livestock feeders, things like that. So Missouri's is, I printed it out here. So Missouri's waiver, there's a form you fill out. It's an application for a CDL waiver for farm-related services. In Missouri, it's Form 4008, if you're ever wondering. And it's basically what it does is it allows a seasonal driver to obtain restricted Class B or Class C CDL license without the written or skills testing. So they're still getting that B or C license, but it's exempting them from some of the testing requirements. Missouri doesn't allow an A. That's another area where some states may provide that exemption or that waiver for A's, but Missouri is not one of those. It's B's and C's in Missouri. So,
In your experience, have you watched those state laws? Have you watched them change very often? Do they get put in place and held? Is it something that the listeners need to go back and verify yearly, or is it really a routine thing?
it's relatively routine, Jim. I mean, there's always changes that can take place with the regulations, as we know. I mean, they update those things regularly. I don't want to say often, but regularly. And usually, when they're updated, it's pretty well publicized and people know about it. The difference is when it comes to these CDL requirements is the states are kind of in charge of that stuff, especially when it comes to waivers and exemptions in that particular state. So it may not be as highly publicized. It may not be out there quite as much as if it was a regulation that was going to affect the entire industry, not just a farm waiver in a specific state. So it's good that, again, it's kind of going back to the beginning of this where I said, everybody thinks, well, the ag community's got it easy because nothing applies to them. Well, actually, they got to know more because they got to know the exceptions and the exemptions as well. That's one of those things where if you're utilizing that waiver, or whether it's the farm waiver or the restricted CDL for those certain farm-related industries, if you're using that stuff, it's probably a good practice to check up on that every year to make sure nothing's changing, that we don't expect that our drivers are fine either running without a CDL or running with that restricted CDL, and something's changed in that state. So that's something that they can talk to their ag associations, trucking associations in those states, contact the DOR, like here in Missouri, Department of Revenue, license office, state driver's licensing agencies, the local ones, they would have that information. It's good to check up on that stuff. Anytime you're using an exemption, I mean, the burden falls on whoever's using the exemption to get it right. They put them out there to use, but you got to use them right. So that's a good point. I mean, I think it's important for them to check up on that stuff to make sure that what they're doing is still in place. So there's some exceptions and some exemptions for the waivers for the CDL. One other big area that we find some exceptions is in Part 391, which is the qualification of drivers. There are certain things that fall under this, but the custom operations is something that I remember probably back in the early to mid 2000s. I visited several large custom farming operations that would basically make a big haul through Kansas doing the wheat harvest. And they would take off from Missouri and go out there and just harvest their way north. They fell into this area of a custom operation, and they got confused on what applied to them, what didn't apply to them, what exemptions could be utilized. But they put into the regulations some exceptions from Part 391 for drivers who are operating a commercial motor vehicle controlled by or operated by a person engaged in custom harvesting. Okay, that's the way the definition reads. And it's if that commercial motor vehicle is used to transport machinery, supplies, or both to or from a farm for a custom harvesting operation on that farm, or transport custom harvested crops to storage or market. So it's pretty specific there. If the exception applies, if they're part of that custom operation, 391 doesn't apply except for two areas, and they both have to deal with texting while driving and using handheld devices while operating the vehicle. Those two regulations are found in 391, 15E and F. Those would still apply, but those qualification parts of it in 391, they wouldn't. There's farm vehicle drivers that could be exempted for straight trucks, for combination vehicles. Again, these are in addition to or separate from that covered farm vehicle we were talking about before, which came through in that map 21. But certain farm vehicle drivers, Part 391 wouldn't apply again if it's controlled by the farmer, used to transport that ag commodity, farm supply, things like that. They're not being used in a for-hire capacity, not carrying any hazardous material that requires a placard, and they're being used within 150 miles of the farm. Part 391 wouldn't apply, except for those two areas that I mentioned before. We're talking about texting or using handheld devices. And it's the same thing for articulated vehicles for the most part. So there are some exceptions that are in place in the regulations from Part 391. Those are standalone exemptions that are in the regulations that are outside that covered farm vehicle.
We've been talking a lot about exemptions. I have not heard it out of your lips, and I don't mean to be maybe opening a significant can of worms here, but are there exemptions on roadworthiness of these vehicles?
Like here in Missouri, if the farm vehicles, the covered farm vehicles, are not going to be scrutinized quite like your for-hire trucking companies or, trucks that are running across the scales, things like that. Primarily because their exposure is just different.
Yeah.
It's you're coming from the farm, either going to market or going to the bend. You're not out on the highways like some of those are, but some of them do. I mean, there's some farmers here where I live, in Missouri, that they may take grain to St. Louis to the river.
Yeah.
Well, now they're getting some exposure. They're on I-70. They're on 61, which is a big highway. They're in downtown St. I mean, they got to go through St. Louis to get downtown. So there's some exposure there. So the roadworthiness, yes, they've got to be roadworthy, but the scrutinization of those vehicles is not as much as would be so for the over-the-road drivers.
I think that is one of the most honest answers that I would have expected. You, I catch a lot on the interstates going to like the Port of Catoosa here in Oklahoma, anywhere where there's a grain port. These producers, whether it's a large farm or it's a cooperative, they're shipping from these country elevators somewhere. If they don't have a railroad out, and maybe they're making more money in a port. I don't run into too many roughed up semi trucks. These are a lot of cab bobbers that are as small as they can be in tip top shape, hauling that grain through the city, like you're talking about. Um, Entirely different than my Uncle Jim hauling grain 8 miles into town and he's crossing a highway. That's it, So I just figured I better ask that one so that I
Yeah.
know. A little bit of a curveball here, and I know that you appreciate when I ask these zingers. I brought up those third party drivers to you, and I think you hit that well. I've ran into this where the third party will hook up their tractor to the farmer's trailer. I mean, do those numbers from the trailer to the tractor, what is the effect? I mean, it follows the number on the tractor, right? So that having a farm tag on your grain trailer, what's the advantage of people trying to do this, or is there no advantage?
Well, if they're bringing third party in, yeah, it's going to go whatever's on the truck is what roadside enforcement is going to look at. What the regulatory requirements for that's going to be based on who's operating that truck and what's on the side of the truck. If it says Jim Seibert Farms and it's got a farm tag on it, it's your truck and you're pulling your grain, you're going to potentially have some covered farm vehicle exemptions, or if you don't get those, then you may have some other exemptions in the regulations. If it's a third party coming in, it's just a for hire outfit. I mean, they are going to be held to most of the regulations, except for maybe one that we haven't gotten to. That's a big one that a lot of folks use, but they're just a for hire trucking company. I mean, everything's going to apply to them unless they can hit one of these exceptions or exemptions that we're talking about. So, yeah, they're very specific on these farm exemptions, that where it's coming from, where it's going, who owns it, and who the driver is.
I really appreciate that answer, because you're helping me the next time I run into this situation, which it's going to happen. Farmers are going, come harvest time. It's a 20-hour day. These guys are going on low sleep. They got, if especially the big ones, they've got to get the crop out of the field when it's right. They've got to haul it when it's right. Um, what about the hours of service for some of these folks? The
Yeah.
395.
Yeah, that's a big one, Jim, because this is something that when you look in the regulations, this doesn't necessarily say farmer, you know. And there's, if you guys go look in Part 390, there's a definition for farmer. There's a definition for covered farm vehicle. There's a definition for farm vehicle driver. They define this stuff. But in 395, the hours of service, it doesn't necessarily talk about a farmer. It's talking about agricultural operations. So how this is set up is the really the entirety of Part 395 wouldn't apply if the driver is transporting an ag commodity from the source of the ag commodity to a location within a 150-mile radius of the source, a farm supply for agricultural purposes from a wholesale or retail distribution point of the farm supplies to a farm or location where the farm supplies are intended. Again, we're looking at that 150 air mile radius, or farm supplies for agricultural purposes from a wholesale distribution point of the farm to a retail distribution point of the farm supplies within that 150-mile radius. So, what are agricultural commodities? What are farm supplies? What are these things? Well, typically when you think about ag commodities, you're thinking about grain, livestock, things like this. But one of the big ones that I see that folks that I talk with on a regular basis utilize this exemption for is like propane and anhydrous. These can be farm supplies for agricultural purposes. Obviously, anhydrous is utilized for the application in fields, and propane is utilized for dryers on bins, things like that. So these can be farm supplies that are used for agricultural purposes if they can meet the definition of those things I just read, which is in 395.1K. They're very specific in there about what you can and can't do, and we're just looking to that 150 air mile radius. And the FMCSA has actually got a really nice PowerPoint presentation that talks about this 150 air mile radius from the distribution point, delivery point, things like that. They've got some diagrams and the radius drawn, and it really explains it really well, which we're not going to do that today. But if you're interested in that, we'll try to provide a link to that, or at least maybe a description of where you can find that. I've got the PowerPoint. I do not remember exactly where they have it on their site, but the FMCSA puts it on their website somewhere. And it's a great visual representation of what this agricultural exemption is talking about. And again, this is not just for farmers. This is just for agricultural operations. So that could be a for-hire motor carrier that meets the 3 bullet points there that I just described. They get that exemption. If they're hauling, maybe it's grain, maybe it's anhydrous, maybe it's propane. That they could get that if they meet all those criteria and they're staying within the 150 air mile radius. So again, that's one of those things where I've got folks that utilize it. I've got folks that say, you know what, we're only going to utilize it if we absolutely have to. If we can do it, like if they're a for hire company and they said, well, we could use this ag exemption or this agricultural operation exemption, but if we can do this load and we're going to do it and we've got the hours, we're just going to log it like we normally would. Some folks will take that stance on it. Um, but either way, this is an exemption of Part 395. There's also parts of the regulation that talk about drivers being ill and fatigued. They're not exempted from that. So if a driver would get stopped and a roadside enforcement officer determined that they were fatigued, even though they might be getting an agricultural exemption, it still could be a violation there. So, because you kind of hit it on the head, we know what harvest is like. I grew up in a rural area here in Missouri, and I mean, when it hits, you can tell when it's harvest season, all the farmers they're going to hit the fields roughly. I mean, if in your geographic area, they're going to hit the fields at the same time, and you're going to see all kinds of combines and grain carts and straight trucks and semis and stuff like that coming in and out of fields and they're working hard. They're working long hours and almost cool for me to see sometimes. Like up here where I'm at, you can take a drive in certain areas and you can just look out across the fields and you can see the lights of the combines and the dust flying and it's maybe 10, 30, 11 o'clock at night and they're still trying to get stuff out of the fields and it's just a testament to the hard workers that they are and like you said at the beginning of this podcast, Jim, about how hard they work to keep food on our tables and keep this country going, which I can't tell you how much I appreciate, but they're hard workers and it can be around the clock. But when we're talking about you know, their employees or them getting in a truck and driving, they may get that hours of service exemption, but you know, this is a safety podcast, right?
Yeah.
So we're
Yeah.
talking, it's like if you're getting out on the road with other folks and you're tired and it's becoming an issue, that's one of those areas where you may need to govern yourself, even though you don't have the hour restrictions. It's like I can't do this safely. I'm too tired.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We're knocking at the end of this podcast, but I want to ask you hazardous materials. You were just mentioning that at the end of your last big stanza there, talking about hazardous materials and these ag exemptions. Yeah, I mentioned some at the beginning. I mean, I'm thinking about my cooperatives that are hauling propane and hydrous, even the farmers that come in and hook up to 3 or 4 bullets at anhydrous, they're typically doing that with their farm truck, and hitting the first gravel road they can get. But in terms of these ag exemptions, if they're hauling hazardous materials, what do they maybe fall under? Yeah, I'm just speaking in ignorance here, but the placarding, the rules of how much they can haul, how does that all work together? And under that ag exemption, I mean, it's kind of tough for me to think about where we require some serious training and CDL levels to be going down an interstate, and then certain folks, certain times of the year, can they just hook on to something and haul it?
I think I'll start because you're hitting it right on the head of how complex this can get, even with our agricultural operations. But I want to start by laying out some of the agricultural products that people may or may not think about when we're talking about an agricultural operation and the hazmat that they might be using. We've already talked about a couple, the anhydrous and the propane. That's something that is listed that would be part of an agricultural operation. But obviously, gasoline and diesel fuel, farmers are using this, or ag operations are using this. Ammonium nitrate, there's certain pesticides, things like that are utilized. But one thing that it was actually put in a publication that I don't know if it was I think it was PHMSA put together, was lithium ion batteries and equipment. And I think Jim, you and I have worked with some companies that you probably know where I'm going with this, but in today's ag world, drones and the use of drones in custom application has become a big deal. And those lithium ion batteries and equipment, it's a class 9 hazardous material. So that's something that's their hazard class. But those are just some of the just a few of the ag products that could be part of your operation that you might be hauling. And when we look at what applies, what doesn't apply, it really kind of depends on how much we're hauling. Is this an amount we have to placard? Is it an amount is exempt from placarding? As I'd said, through many of those regulations we were talking about before, whether it's a covered farm vehicle or a farm vehicle driver, if you're hauling a placardable amount of hazmat, you lose those exemptions from the safety regulations for sure. But when we're talking about the hazardous material regulations, then what applies to us? What is the regulatory points that are going to hit us, even if we're part of an ag operation, or we're pulling one of those ag commodities. And some of that stuff, again, it just depends on whether or not you've got enough product on that requires placarding. But one of the things I wanted to hit on while we've got a little bit of time here is nurse tanks, because you mentioned that. But when we look at nurse tanks under the hazardous materials regulations, they're accepted from the packaging specification requirements if it's the minimum design pressure meets the ASME code, and I'm not going to get into all that stuff because there's a lot of information on that, but it's equipped with safety valves. It's painted right, so it's white or it's aluminum, has a capacity of 3,000 gallons or less, loaded filling density. So there's all these criteria that you got to meet. But it could be accepted from the packaging requirements and then in conformance with these regulations, the hazmat regulations, including placarding, except shipping papers aren't required and the markings and placards are not required if the valves on the ends, are in a place where you can't get a placard on it. So there are certain exemptions and exceptions you get from the hazardous material regulations on nurse tanks. The amount of the hazmat that we're hauling, again, depends. That's going to dictate how many of these hazardous material regulations apply to you as a farm or an ag operation. But typically, if we're putting placards on a load, you're looking at being regulated from the hazardous materials regulations. You're not going to get a ton of exemptions. Those nurse tanks, again, I kind of read down through some of those where we're talking about some of the exemptions that they get. There are other exemptions that you can get, but it's just like these safety regulations that we're talking about. You've got to meet certain criteria, and if you don't meet the criteria, you're not going to get the exemption from the hazmat regs either. So it's important that they know. There's a document that we can provide. Again, it's kind of like that PowerPoint presentation I was talking about with the hours of service regs. There's a really good document that PHMSA puts out that deals with this topic about hazardous materials and ag operations and whether or not you're considered a farmer. Are you transporting between fields on local roads, transporting class 2 materials between fields on local roads, transporting from a farm to farm? They've got all these definitions. And if you meet those, are you considered a farmer? Do you get the exemptions? Do you get the exceptions? And then what are you getting exempted from? Are you getting exempted from all of the hazmat regulations? It could just be that you're getting exempted from stuff like the emergency response information, training requirements, packaging requirements, just like on those nurse tanks. So there's a lot to unpack there. And my recommendation is that the folks that are listening, especially Jim, the guys that you deal with on a regular basis, the co-ops, things like that you're talking to somebody that's familiar with these regs, with the exemptions, to determine whether or not they're in compliance when they're pulling this type of commodity. And again, if it's an ag commodity or an agricultural product, it's part of an ag operation. Once we determine that, then we can start digging in and seeing, well, how much are we hauling? Where are we hauling it to? Where are we hauling it from? Are we getting any kind of exemption or exception because it is an ag product? And is the person we're talking about, is it a farmer or not? So a lot to unpack there. And again, I highly recommend that if you're pulling that hazmat up and down the road, that you're talking to somebody, either a consultant, somebody in the regulatory world that can help you kind of wade through those regulations and the exemptions you may or may not get.
You listeners have heard us talking about our passion to be a lifelong learner. I know that this was a much, much different topic than we normally cover. And me being the ag guy, bringing some ag into it. I hope that if you started this podcast with us and you are here at the end, that I appreciate it because you heard something new today. You heard you had an opportunity to learn about other pieces of equipment, other trucks that are on the road, the regionality, the geographies, the seasons that we go throughout a year, and what you may encounter. And so I hope there were some good takeaways. This is really a lot for my customers. There is so many different scenarios. If you pick that up from Mike on this podcast, I tried to throw a bunch of knuckleballs at him with some of the things that I run into. There's not a generic answer. There are many, many different scenarios, and the lack of uniformity from operation to operation, company to company. Mike did a great job of laying out many of the eaches, but you probably are still scratching your head a little bit. And so I encourage you, we're going to do our best to put this FMCSA PowerPoint or the source that Mike talked about earlier, that 150-mile radius explanation, get another couple sources included in there. There's a reason Mike was the one talking today, and me not bringing up my confusion any more than I did and discussing more of what I run into. You need to call us. You need to send us an email. You need to reach out to a Mike or a Kenny that know these regulations and can really dig in and help you find the right answer for what you guys are doing, what your operation is doing. And Barry is coming right along, and he's ready to field questions as well. And so thanks for hanging with us through a different type of trucking and safety discussion today. For all of us at Driving the Line, the podcast that's always in the pursuit of safety. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.
That's all the time we have for this edition of Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Until the next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.